And I think that's it. So without further ado, here is Everything is Not Awesome with Jason Beatty.
Thank you. So I got to talking with my coworkers about segmentation in the context of WannaCry and then Petya. And there's widespread consensus amongst us, plus the Twitterverse, that network segmentation is generally a good thing, and that complex network segmentation or more robust network segmentation beyond like a DMZ and a guest network is a good thing. But then why don't we see it implemented more often? So in my consulting background, I didn't see it very often. And a lot of places were like, yeah, we know it's good, but. And so I want to talk about those cases constructively. So I don't want to be like, hey, these people are lazy, or hey, these people are dumb. All these people meant well. All these people tried. And for some reason, their projects failed or stalled. And so we need to talk about that constructively and figure out ways to overcome these particular barriers. So things I've been at some point in time, besides the BSidesLV backup photographer, I've been a systems admin for Windows and way back in the day, NetWare, firewall admin, network engineer, and then I got promoted to managing director. So I ran a IT infrastructure group, did budgeting and project management and all of the things associated with running a couple different teams. And then I moved to being a security consultant. And so I got a lot of different looks at a lot of different places, a lot of different verticals, and helping clients building and maturing their particular security programs. And the second reason is because I made a lot of these bad excuses myself. And so this is my chance to sort of come clean and to talk to you all about some of the things that I've said where I said, yeah, we can't do this because of this reason. So I'm just as guilty as anybody else. So we're going to play a little bit of a game, get people moving a little bit. But if you've either said one of these things or been responded to with one of these particular things, go ahead and raise your hand. I'm going to raise my hand now because I've said all of these things. But the first one is, we'll be seen as disruptive if we block business-related traffic. We'll get a few steps in and they'll push back. So anybody? Excellent. Okay. If the attackers have gotten this far, they already own us anyway, so we're not going to. Excellent. Okay, cool. We're not staffed to conduct or maintain an internal segmentation effort of this magnitude, so we can't do this and our day jobs. Okay, a little bit less, but good. Excellent. Our firewall cannot handle all of the internal traffic, so if we push all this internal segmentation effort into this particular firewall, it'll overrun it, and our budget won't cover buying another. Anybody? Excellent. Okay, cool. So I'm not alone. So there's a couple elephants in the room. Whenever we're talking about these particular things, I have 20 minutes to go ahead and give this talk. And so internal network segmentation is one facet of a much larger and layered defense in depth strategy. And so there's obviously things that play in very, very well into these particular strategies. And so when you're doing network segmentation, you want to look at application whitelisting. You want to look at your endpoint protection, data classification, another areas that play into this. But because we've got a limited amount of time, I want to try to keep it right on target. But there will be a few tangents, and so if we have time at the end, we'll dive into more of those, and we'll definitely talk about those. So when we're talking about network segmentation, sometimes it's difficult to say what good segmentation looks like because it depends. It depends what you do as a business, and it depends kind of, a lot of different factors associated with your budget, your staffing, and all of that. But we definitely know what bad segmentation looks like. And so we'll start out by defining the negative, if you will. So we know that crunchy exterior and chewy center model is really, really bad. And in this particular diagram, what I'm talking about is the stuff on the bottom. All of that is the internal network, and all of it has implicit trust to everything else. And so you've got sales laptops that can get to database servers and core databases and other proprietary information in the business. And the other thing that we commonly see, and this is fairly terrible, but we see that implicit trust then waterfalling down to DMZ and possible web servers. And so the internal network is assigned a higher security level, if you will, and the DMZ is assigned a lower one, and they're just allowing the implicit trust to roll all the way down to that. So that's also terrible in terms of attack surfaces and other bad stuff that could occur. And so defining what good segmentation is, like I said, it's a little bit more difficult, and it depends a little bit more. But we can talk about, in general, what these sorts of things might look like. And so DMZs and guest networks are a great start. And I don't want to, for some reason, malign those, because they're definitely essential. They serve a really, really good purpose. But don't stop there. And so what I'm talking about is looking at particular business workflows. And so diving in and saying, if you have, say, an accounting department or whatever else, or you're looking at just accounts payable, you want to look at their particular workflows and say, okay, how do you go ahead and cut checks to a given vendor, or to to fulfill expenses for your employees, and so on and so forth, and then define the internal boundaries around those things. And so you want to make sure you understand exactly where to go ahead and set up that particular swim lane. And then you want to fall back to least privilege models if they don't need it. So no one else in the business should be able to access those particular servers if they don't need them. That's what we're talking about in terms of robust internal network segmentation. And again, this is common sense stuff. I see a lot of heads nodding and all of that. But if these things are common sense, why don't we see them more often is sort of the thing that we're trying to attack here. And so that first thing that we kind of, the first two items in the list, I'm going to kind of sum those up as segmentation is too difficult but it's really, we'll be seen as disruptive if we block business-related traffic. We'll get a few steps in and they'll push back. And then if the attackers have gotten this far, they already own us anyway. So I owe this terminology, by the way, to my old boss, Mark Stanislav, who now works at Duo. But he came up with the coin slot rail approach, which is effectively if you're trying to sort coins and you're rolling things down a rail or whatever else, you're going to match the smallest coin first. It's going to go ahead and drop in. Next coin, so on and so forth. He referred to this in matching PCI SAQ types, but it definitely applies in terms of this as well. But generally, if your strategy is block it and see who screams, you're not going to get very far. You're going to get some sort of disruptive change that occurs. Somebody's going to go ahead and escalate around to a C-level exec of some sort, and then they're going to go ahead and derail your project. And so we need to find a way to do non-disruptive change, and we need to take a slow and steady approach to it. So when I'm talking about this, one of the things that I would recommend is we know we need to secure IT. Those accounts are kind of the sweet spot for an attacker looking for a lot of lateral movement, and we know we need to address those particular workflows really, really soon. Call it in phase 1 of this particular project. But I don't recommend them step 1, phase 1. Maybe step 3, step 4, or whatever else. So attack something that's a little bit easier. Payroll and HR, not that they're particularly simplistic, they have their complexities as well, but they have some built-in separation of duty in there. And so what's nice is there's some discrete separations that might help you out in terms of a segmentation project. And so when I'm talking about going ahead and doing non-disruptive change, what I'm talking about is taking advantage of that first match, the coin slot rail approach sort of things with common firewalls, where you can go ahead and write a very, very specific ACL, where you go ahead and say this one user group, this accounts payable or smaller team, can go ahead and access this particular server over this particular group of ports or this particular port. And you can even narrow it down even further if you know that there are certain time ranges that they access these particular things. They don't work at night, so on and so forth. May not be true, but get as specific as you possibly can. And where you would normally put a deny beneath that, the deny would be disruptive. And so put a more general rule beneath that. So that's the next layer of that coin slot model. Again, sort of common sense, but go ahead and roll that through. But where we see people failing, when I was doing firewall reviews, I was looking at those things and then seeing that a lot of these rules were stagnating. So they weren't continuing to go ahead and groom these particular rules and find out where they could go ahead and then put that explicit deny to say, okay, no one else can go ahead and access these things. And so one really, really good strategy for that is to go ahead and set up regular recurring meetings to go ahead and review all of the workflows that you're trying to go ahead and narrow down and have your peers go ahead and enforce and say, hey, we need to figure out, okay, where are the hits on these particular rules? What things are going ahead and hitting these more general rules that we can write more specific ones on top of that? Go ahead and keep on revisiting and keep on iterating in terms of that. And so as I was doing this particular project, we ran into a problem where we got a little confident a little bit too early. And so we went ahead and started to do our explicit denies and narrowed things down. And then we realized that accounting doesn't necessarily work on daily or weekly schedules. There's monthly, there's quarterly, there's yearly stuff that happens, and we got a little aggressive. And so we got called into the principal's office to a certain extent, caused some disruptive change. It was no good, and my attitude wasn't great back then, honestly. And so I was like, well, screw it. If they're telling us we need to go ahead and roll back all of this stuff, then I guess we won't do it. And I got some really, really good mentoring at that time, and it was there are two ways do things the easy way and the right way. And if you do things the right way long enough, they become easy. And I'm aware that this fails a tautology check. But at any rate, I got sick of hearing that, but eventually I was the one parroting that to my staff as well. And it's absolutely true in terms of a network segmentation, virtualization effort, any of the big efforts that you go ahead and do, is that you're going to need to go ahead and iterate, but you're going to hit some friction at some points, and you need to just keep on pushing through that. So it may be 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but keep on pushing through that. And then if for some reason it's not getting easier, I had to kind of reflect and look back and say, part of the problem was kind of me. And so when I was going out to the business and I was doing these interviews, I was asking questions from the mindset of, how do I get the information that I need and get the heck out of here so I can get back to doing my normal job? Rather than aligning with them and saying, here, I understand that you need to do X, Y, and Z. Can you tell me a little bit more about why? Can you tell me when these processes kick in? And to help align with them, but also to kind of build that empathy a little bit. I wasn't doing that initially, and so these projects were failing. And I realized that they weren't failing because of lack of knowledge. They were failing because of my attitude. And so if there's anything to be gained, I guess just try to align yourself better, try to ask the right questions, or try to learn what the right questions are to ask. Kind of tee those up for people and try to empathize with what exactly they need in order to get their job done to keep the business running. So the other one, if the attackers have gotten this far, then it's over. This is one where particular pen test, they did the external, and then they came and did internal, and they were plugged into an internal data center switch. And the guy was telling me, well, hey, there's a setting on this particular switch that allows me to go ahead and move laterally between ports and all of that. And I kind of said, that's great, but you're physically present in my data center. Gabe's kind of up at that point. You're kind of, you've got physical access to all of the servers as well. That response made it to the report that went to the CTO. And again, I was back in the principal's office again. And it was like, hey, you can't just go ahead and dismiss this stuff. It's not necessarily your job to determine where and when to surrender. And the CTO said, it's not my job either. That's the guy who signs the checks. That's the CEO's job. In the meantime, we're supposed to work as hard as we can to go ahead and patch and go ahead and remediate as many of these things as we possibly can, or at least discuss them. You don't get to determine where and when we decide to give up. And so the takeaway was treat every part of your network as absolute defensible ground. Don't just go ahead and pick and say, okay, if they get here, then the gig's up and we're done. And so we started looking at printer segments. We started looking at network management segments. We started looking at backup segments and saying, hey, these provide a ton of movement and we're not doing any sort of detection or prevention inside these networks at all. And so we started going ahead and securing those as well. And the nice thing is that we knew those inside and out. Those were incredibly predictable networks to go ahead and start segmenting, and we just hadn't done it before because we figured, okay, if they're there already, then like I said, the gig's up. So we kept stacking those defenses, both preventive and detective controls. And so next one, internal network segmentation is impossible to maintain. So once we set it up, we're not staffed to conduct or maintain an internal network segmentation effort of this magnitude. We can't do this and our day jobs. And the short answer is it is your day job, sorry. But let's talk about this constructively to a certain extent. It's rare that I saw a IT or IS team that was grossly overstaffed or bored. But what I did see was a lot of organizations that overpurchased. So they had too many or conflicting or overlapping security tools, or they overlicensed the tools that they had. And the reason that they did that is that they didn't understand all of the workflows that were in place in their business, right? They were just going ahead and buying things and assuming that all of these particular workflows were equal. And in reality, when you dug into it, they didn't necessarily need all of the same tool sets. And so that was kind of a takeaway as well. A lot of these teams failed to automate repetitive and time-consuming tasks, and so they had some decision fatigue as well. They burned time and effort on detection alerting schemes that had way too poor of a signal-to-noise ratio. And so there was some frustration in and around that, and they basically said, I can't do all of this stuff and do the rest of this, when in reality they needed to go ahead and reduce that particular friction. It's sort of akin to learning scripting or learning even like touch typing. If you take the time to go ahead and muscle through it and learn it, it pays dividends in the future. You don't have to waste time doing that simple stuff. And so that fact-finding, that gathering of information, and applying that network segmentation effort basically leads you to placing more specific tools, not just in the segmentation effort, but just in general, getting better in terms of your detection, figuring out what doesn't matter, and kind of pushing the hay aside to find the needles, and reducing that cost and that noise. And the second thing is as we went through and did this network segmentation effort, that knowledge is really empowering. And so you work more effectively, but it's palpable excitement because you understand a lot at a much deeper level exactly how all of this stuff comes together. Internal network segmentation will overrun our current hardware. So I've been phrasing a lot of these sometimes as an excuse. This one's more legit, if you will. Not that any of these are particularly excuses, but this one, could definitely bite you. So our firewall cannot handle all the internal traffic on our network, and our budget won't cover buying another. So the first thing, I guess, is to don't try to go ahead and boil the ocean. Don't calculate out all of the traffic that you might possibly need to segment and then say, okay, well, the firewall won't handle it, so let's not even start. That's kind of defeating the purpose to a certain extent. And so start off with, like I said, a simpler workflow and figure out what kind of horsepower you're going to go ahead and need to get the rest of the job done, and start scoping that out. So start figuring out exactly what models or what might make sense to go ahead and finish the job, but don't just stop just because you can't go ahead and complete to 100%. The second thing is obviously use analysis to look for noise or garbage or abuse, and possibly either write policies or get somebody on your side to basically reduce some of that stuff. So if you've got a lot of streaming audio and other stuff going over your network that's not necessarily business related, but it's clogging up firewall cycles and all of that, it's possible that you can go ahead and say, hey, we've got better ways to go ahead and get you audio and better ways to go ahead and get you fantasy football stats and so on and so forth. Vendors will often say, let's reduce the logging capability or reduce the logging detail on the firewalls, and I'm not a huge fan of that. That cuts into your forensic audit trail, but there is such a thing as information overload. So if you're at a debug level and you don't necessarily need to be at that debug level, make sure you're tuning that appropriately. I saw that in a lot of firewall reviews, is that they're all the way up on the meter, and they weren't using any of that particular information. But obviously, like if you have got functionality that you don't need, like DNS and DHCP server functionality, I saw that as well, it's not going to get you a whole lot of gains in terms of CPU cycles or memory on your firewall, but it's something. And so start looking at what your firewall needs to do necessarily, and then figure out what else. Consider offloading some workstation ACLs. I've had some good discussions in and around this. The problem with that is, some of the fancy next generation firewalls have some really nice features in terms of dynamic ACLs. So a group then gets a ACL applied to it. You can't necessarily do that at the switch level, at least not unless you have a really, really nice client that kind of routes that all the way through. And so that might be the problem. But if you have some simpler ACLs that are just go ahead and block, we don't need to go ahead and analyze this traffic, let's just go ahead and drop it. You can set up your SIM to go ahead and log that and alert on it. If you're seeing some sort of lateral movement in your distro switches or below, that might go ahead and help your burden. And then the last thing, and again, I'll apologize for being Captain Obvious here, but you need to push for that understanding that robust internal segmentation is not a nice to have anymore. It's not the difference between an A and an A plus anymore. The attacks that we're seeing definitely require a much more detailed level of segmentation than we're seeing currently. And so you need to make that case to whoever it is that would be going ahead and justifying the budget for building out this effort. So we're at 2 minutes. Okay. I have to speed through this just a little bit. I apologize. I had some learned helplessness. So I had some things where, I obviously declared defeat long before we were actually defeated. And so learn to recognize that to a certain extent. Learn to inoculate it by talking to your peers, if you will, and saying, hey, if you're seeing this coming out of my mouth, call me on it. Call me on my BS. So if I'm saying, hey, well, if they're not going to give us funding for this, I guess we're not going to do it. Instead, you want to say, okay, well, if they're not going to give us funding, how do we either talk to them about it? How do we formulate a plan to, get around this particular barrier? Or how do we come up with an open source alternative? How do we come up with a way to go ahead and do this that doesn't require nearly as much money? Or what else can we give up if this is indeed more important? But come up with solutions rather than just coming up with ways, picking places where you'd go ahead and give up. And then learning to love and leverage your compliance burden. So I used to spend a lot of time basically saying, hey, the PCI audit's going to be happening in May. So I just blocked off my calendar for all of May, and I said, okay, nothing's going to get done from this time. Okay, excellent. 5 minutes, almost done. So, I used to basically just dread it because I was always going to be behind at the end of May. When in reality, I should have been leveraging it. I should have been using that compliance burden to justify a lot of the things that I absolutely needed because it was a really, really good stick to go ahead and do that. But unfortunately, that means learning the language of the business, learning the compliance. It's kind of like radioactivity. You don't want to get any on you, but business risks, task cycles, role descriptions, all of that stuff. It's absolutely essential for communicating and getting budget justification for this sorts of stuff, but it's how you win. And so find somebody that can do that, or you have to take it on yourself. You have to shoulder that burden as well. And the second thing is, and this is a story from mine, but I got into the elevator and the CEO was in there and he's like, hey, how's that, the PCI project going, and what do you need if for some reason things go poorly? And I struck out because I didn't have any sort of reporting. I didn't have anything I could show him. I didn't have something where I could say, hey, I wrote a report on that. Do you want me to mail you on it? Or whatever else. So luck favors the prepared. So get quotes, figure out exactly the constructive solutions, ways to attack things that you can't necessarily justify today, but have that ready in case the situation presents itself to do it. I referred to it as making ransomware lemonade a while back, but yeah. And so what does the finish line look like? And so we go from this model where we've got the Chewy center, and we're going ahead and breaking all those things out. And we no longer have that implicit trust model. So all of these lines are explicit trust, specific ACLs that we're going ahead and allowing. And we're adding, like I cheated and I added some other technologies in here that I said we wouldn't talk about, but things like NAC and all of that fun stuff. But that's kind of the goal that I'm talking about and the goal that we're shooting for. So you may never be done, but here's where things get really good. Like I said, your licensing, your alerting, your budgeting start getting really more efficient. You realize that not everybody might need the exact same tools, or you figure out exactly what you need in order to get the job done for each of these particular workflows. And I hope that you're going ahead and documenting these things so that if for some reason somebody leaves, they don't leave with all of that knowledge. You can go ahead and transfer that knowledge over. That was a big sticking point with us, as we had a ton of tribal knowledge that we lost every single time we lost an employee. So you want to go ahead and do that. The second reason is a lot of these workflows are only used maybe once or twice a year sometimes, and so you won't remember. You've got tons of other battles to fight. You'll come back to this one and you won't remember the details, so definitely document it. But your network and your ACLs will start mimicking your business processes and look a lot less like the vendor defaults. And that'll help you a ton because the particular attacker is going to have to spend a lot more time trying to feel out exactly what the heck, where are they on the particular network and where do they need to get to. Give them a little bit of a maze to run. Excellent, 2 minutes. Local firewalls and host-based intrusion detection, prevention agents. So I get the excuse a lot of times, well, we haven't really done a whole lot of complexity in terms of host-based intrusion protection or host-based firewalls because we don't really know what they need. Well, you will once you go ahead and do this and document. And then a suggestion from Jerry Bell, malicious link, is you can go ahead and start looking at distro switch port isolation. So you basically say, hey, if you're on the same segment and you're communicating, don't go ahead and allow that implicit trust where one node can communicate to the other directly through the switch. It's got to have to go back up a layer or two. That's definitely a really, really strong tactic to go ahead and do if you want to limit that lateral movement. And then, like I said, the attackers will need more time to run that maze. Set your detective controls such that you can go ahead and detect them and then possibly eject them from your network. There was a question when I was discussing this as well of, will you run into the top end limit of ACLs? This is a terrible way to evaluate firewalls, by the way. I apologize. So take this with a giant grain of salt. But yeah, the theoretical limits on the number of ACLs for various platforms are relatively large. You will hit throughput, you will hit module memory limits, you will hit tons of other things before you hit these things. But people were asking exactly what the theoretical limits were, so kind of look this up. That's it. I want to thank my employer, CTC, for giving me the time to come here and talk to you. I also wanted to thank Adam Brand, who mentored me on this. And let's continue the conversation. There's my Twitter handle. So if you want to DM me. I apologize, I overran a little bit of the time for questions, but if there's a couple quick ones.
Any questions? We have time for like one question. All right, well, you can always contact him on Peerlist, one of our wonderful sponsors, or on Twitter. And we'll see you in a few minutes for the next talk.
Thank you.